Hello, welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Jason Memel, and today we're chatting with Terry and Puka from the Mage podcast. And in particular, we're talking about an episode they released recently that provided an excellent speed-through overview of the various branches of Gnosticism. We're going to discuss their experience of researching that show, talking about it, what it's like borrowing from history and faith for the purposes of a role-playing game. And for this episode, we're going to assume you're familiar with at least some of Gnosticism, but maybe less so the World of Darkness role-playing games and Mage in particular. So with that, I'm going to let Terry and Puka introduce themselves and let us know a little bit about the game.
Sure. Hi, my name's Terry Robinson. I am one of the hosts of Mage the podcast. I've been doing it for about 6 years, which is terrifying to say out loud. As far as my background goes, I am generally, if you were to be like, what worldview and what educational background would produce a strict materialist, that is the one I have, where it's like, well, this degree in chemistry is pretty abstract. What if I were to also to get a degree in actuarial science? Um, and that is kind of my background. I started doing Mage the podcast as a bit of a COVID project, and it just didn't stop. And the infuriating thing is, as shown by our Gnosis episode or a Gnostic episode, the more effort I put into it, the more the fans and audience seem to enjoy it, which is absolutely infuriating. The best thing that could possibly happen would be like, I phone it in, same listenership as when I like do 30 hours of research. But Mage the Podcast is a podcast, magethepodcast.com, that talks about the World of Darkness game, Mage the Ascension. The World of Darkness game is a set of games, of which Vampire the Masquerade is probably the best known, that is set in a world like ours, but the supernatural is present and pronounced. The darkness in World of Darkness can mean a number of different things. It can be a world that is strictly worse. It can be one where there are strange things in dark shadows. It is one where the architecture is more gothic and people are more afraid and corporations run the world more. But to me, Mage the Ascension is unique among those games in that rather than being urban horror, it is urban fantasy. The darkness to me is the fact that there are strange things that happen in shadows that can be investigated, but the world isn't necessarily worse. The key metaphysical contrivance of the game is that belief influences reality, and that there has been this war waged over centuries of how to shape the belief of the preponderance of humanity such that we get the world that we want. Sometime around the 14th century, a group of people said, hey, wizards and dragons are not a thing that we want to have. It is restrictive of the common person, and we are going to try and cultivate a worldview that gets rid of those fantastical elements, that gets rid of the strange things from the outside that are trying to influence humanity, but also at the same time destroys kind of wonder. The game takes place in a contemporary world. Kind of by default, you are playing a mage, someone who has something called an awakened avatar, which allows them to more directly influence reality than other people. It has a freeform magic system, so there aren't spells per se, but the idea is that all the domains of reality are broken up into 9 groups, and you as a character have something that allows you to more directly interface with the world than other people do. And this is a game where all philosophical traditions and worldviews are entirely valid. So your character is damaged in the course of play. You get into a firefight, or you try and rescue someone from a burning building and you are injured. You could be healed by nanotechnology. You could be healed by intercessory prayer. You could be healed by some sort of Tibetan breathing exercise. All of them work. The question is, to what degree does reality resist and push back against your worldview? So the idea is that the weight of belief is real and significant, and your character in some way is trying to clad the magic they do in raiment that makes that possible to the outside world. And the game is sometimes been called a philosophy course with fistfights, but the idea is that you and the group of characters are trying to affect change in the world in some way. We on Mage the Podcast do various investigations of the game as system, the game as setting, but also the key thing to me is it has made me realize just how many ways of seeing the world there are. And that is what created the episode on Gnosticism that caused Jason to reach out to me. And that is kind of my very high level view of Mage the Ascension. It is a war for reality. And I just think it's good, clean fun.
Oh, war for reality. Fun. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, not always clean.
But yeah, Puka, you also you're associated with that podcast as well as your own?
Associated, yes. So hi, I'm Puka. I am the co-host of Changeling the podcast, but I also sometimes crawl through the walls to emerge in the Mage the podcast studio, such as for the Gnostic episode. And just to briefly append to Terry's description, Changeling is you play basically a fairy in a human body. That 14th century effort to eradicate wonder deeply influenced the Fae, so they had to take on human flesh to survive. And I'd say it's a game with rather different themes. It's more about balancing your humanity against your otherworldliness and trying to keep that wonder alive in the world. But I would say those two games, probably among all of the World of Darkness lines, they align most frequently. Yeah, so rather different approach, but similar, lots of overlap.
Totally, yeah. Go ahead, Terry.
Both of them are highly informed by actual belief.
Yes.
The thing I most enjoy about Mage is the sheer number of cases where it mentions a community or a faith practice or belief that I just have never heard of. And likewise with Changeling the Dreaming, it is frequently the case that you will hear a term like the Doulahan. I don't know about you, but I was utterly unfamiliar with the idea of there being like headless enforcers of law in Irish mythology. Rusalka, the Selkies, any number of cases. So they are both games that draw heavily from real world belief systems. And if nothing else, just thumbing through the books gives you an idea of like, oh, humans believe a lot of different stuff.
Which is like, I think that was what was so compelling about listening to the episode, is because it was such a, like I said, it's a speed through of like all I think of the major branches and understandings of Gnosticism that we have up at this point, but I think maybe because it was game related or there was a game focus, it meant that rather than getting stuck into like, how do I put this, rather than like having to sort of shift your maybe a paradigm, your mental worldview in each section, it was like, because you're already approaching it not from a position of strict belief, but in like, how does this work in a game? I don't know, like I found it made it really engaging to understand. I should also say I have a little bit of familiarity with the World of Darkness. Like I played Vampire like 20 some years ago. I dug out of my my bookcase here GURPS Mage
That is
the Ascension. Yeah. And I just love the art in this book too. I remember reading this and just like, I never ran a game, but I just fell in love with like a lot of the concepts and stuff. So again, like when I heard your podcast, I was like, oh, it's so great that that these guys are taking that game world and really like investigating the things. And the other thing is GURPS products themselves are also well known for being full of real life stuff that you can then apply to your game, which is, I think, yeah, fascinating. Is there like so I maybe two questions that kind of came to mind just right off the bat was like, there's a lot of research that you had to do for this. Like, how much research did you do for this episode? How much did you, like you said, like 30 hours, like how much do you normally do for an episode?
The paradox of podcasting is I thought it would get easier over time. It in no way has. Like a friend of mine very much enjoys bungee jumping. And I'm like, oh, after a critical point, you just kind of get used to the terror of handing yourself over to gravity. And they say, no, every jump is more anxiety inducing than the last. And I'm like, why do you do this to yourself? But then again, there are people out there that have like 6 children, which I imagine falls into the same category. There's just this weird compulsion. But for background, I was a fan of Mage the Ascension because it poses the question, what do we believe and why? And it asks it in a generous way. in a way that isn't presumptive. And after doing the podcast for a number of years, I had the opportunity to write for a Mage the Ascension book. Lore of the Traditions. One of the factions in the game are the Council of the Nine Mystic Traditions. They basically represent the mystical interpretations of various real world beliefs. We have things like Wicca and neo-primitive movements. We have animism. We have highly religious groups. We have computation as a vector to transcend reality. We have the idea that the cycle of birth and death is sacred. We have a number of Eastern traditions recognized in it, and their enemy is the technocracy. This is a group within the game that says all of this is well and good, but if you teach people to summon a fire elemental to heat up their dinner, now everyone has the ability to summon fire elementals. That's not a great thing. What if instead we invent the microwave? So I got to write in one of these books, and I made a critical mistake. I handed in my work early. I was in a phase of my life where things were very busy, and I'm like, I'm just going to knock this out. I'm going to hand in my section on the Virtual Adepts, and they're like, hey, do you want to do the Celestial Chorus? And the Celestial Chorus is a group within Mage the Ascension that believes that all human faith practices, or at least a large number of them, most of the traditions of the book, kind of point at there being a one thing, that there is an idea that there is the thing that we diverged from, and that ultimately our goal is return to it. This could be anything from mystical Judaism that believes that there is some essential being that scattered itself throughout creation. It could be an idea that there was some progenitor of reality that encountered some dark force that caused it to shatter and is trying to recollect those elements. It could be the belief that humanity just needs to get all of its stuff together, and once we do so, we will be capable of great things. What in AI research is referred to as the alignment problem. And I handed in my section early, and they're like, hey, Terry, do you want to do the Celestial Chorus? And I'm like, well, I'm a lapsed Catholic with little background in comparative religion. Sure. Because I'm really bad at saying no to things. And a strain that has existed in the world of darkness and Mage the Ascension specifically has been this Gnostic idea. And I'm like, well, if I'm going to write this, let's do some homework. Gnosticism to me was first introduced with Karen Armstrong's The History of God. I understand that Karen Armstrong as an author has her own opinions. She's not without fault, but the thing that I appreciate is, one, she does her homework. Two, she tries to capture the feeling of faith, which is, I think, is something that a lot of scholars fail to do. It is hard to explain to someone what it feels like when everyone is reciting the Lord's Prayer in a Catholic service, or everyone is observing a moment of silence, or everyone is bowing before the Kaaba in Mecca. And I think everyone doing the same thing at the same time is a thing that people who are not part of a group faith tradition have difficulty understanding. So that was kind of my starting point. The next was The Other God, which is a history of dualism. Really wish there were an audiobook version of that. I'm much better at ear reading than eye reading. Gnosticism from the Nag Hammadi to the Gospel of Judas by David Brack, which was offered as part of the Great Courses. The Terror of History, which is kind of this course that talks about how human belief changes as our ability to change the world around us changes. Basically, kind of this idea that belief and technology move together, that in kind of I'm going to say a primitive state, we come up with legends to explain the world around us. But as we gain mastery, we tend to have a more abstract God. And then a bunch of Googling and using ChatGPT. And then the movie, and then I remembered the movie Waking Life by Richard Linklater, which brings up a bunch of Gnostic things. And of course, I can't fail to mention the essential Gnostic text to me of Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, because there is a level at which I saw Blade Runner and I'm like, this is stupid. Of course robots would have feelings. And then later I read the exegesis of Philip K. Dick and I'm like, holy shit, this guy was on another level. And suddenly I become the guy that's like, you're not appreciating Blade Runner at the same level that I am. And I suddenly became that which I hated the most. But those were kind of like my core texts. And within the world of darkness, there's a few key Gnostic elements. There's something called the Cainite heresy, which is basically a group of vampires that believe that they have received true wisdom, and that Cain sacrificing Abel was the first attempt to get rid of the demiurge. So it's absolutely wild. And you're like, oh yeah, if you lived for 1,000 years, you'd probably believe some really weird shit too. Within Mage, there isn't really a lot of direct stuff except for various mentions to it. They really like using the phrase Albigensian heresy, which I do too. It's fun. It feels good on the tongue. But those were kind of the starting point. I know Puka is more familiar with a different set of texts than me.
Well, I mean, there is some shared bibliography between us, I think. But to your point, Terry, talking about Mage, with the World of Darkness books in general, I mean, I was probably 12 when I started like flipping through them. And I think that those of us who podcast, at least, it's like those books are things you return to again and again to read, even if games are months or years apart. They are just so full of material that you can tell, even if there was imperfect understanding perhaps behind a lot of it, these were people who were truly as into these wild ideas as we are. So just like reading these pages, be like, whoa, this is amazing.
Yeah, even if it's wrong, you were excited. Kind of that exoticism. Like if you've ever had a small child explain to you the new thing they're super into that is obvious they don't understand, that is the relationship of the World of Darkness with a lot of these things, where it's like, yeah, they have the ability to fly through the air because they have contact with chi. And I'm like, I don't know what any of that means, but I'm going to read and do some follow-up. The World of Darkness is remarkably good at getting you from I didn't know this existed to I know this existed. And there's a lot of criticism to say, hey, this doesn't have a master's degree level of familiarity with the topic, to which I say, I don't care. That is fine.
And the World of Darkness book will have its sources listed, importantly.
Yes. Yeah, there's always a bibliography.
Which is, I mean, that's like, how awesome is it that there's a like ostensibly like still a game, something that is meant for like distraction and fun. I'm putting air quotes here, but like, but yet is so informed by real world history that it creates a fascinating correlation. And in fact, actually, this might be an interesting point to mention. The way I got into Gnosticism. So I was like, I've joked before that I was like a lackadaisical Lutheran. I was raised in a Lutheran church without any real strong compulsion towards it in any way. Like I kind of have a philosophical mind, but I wasn't like moved towards anything that much. And so I would say I was probably like fairly agnostic for quite a long time. And then a friend of mine who was an atheist but a history major and a D&D player ran a game where he used he set it in like, I don't know, like the year like 1000 something or other, and we were like Byzantine envoys, but he brought in like the Nag Hammadi Codex as a thing that had been like found in that point of the world, like just as a, not historically, but his like his own learning about the Nag Hammadi Codex gave him like all these ideas. And I was like, where's all this coming from? I'm fascinated by this. So like I got into this through a role-playing game. And I'm sure I'm not alone.
Yeah, and that was something that was fascinating to me, that as a lifelong materialist, it's one of those things where, like, much like people who are super into UFOs, I don't see the evidence, but I see that there are a lot of otherwise reasonable people that are deeply compelled to that. And even if I don't believe the same thing as them, what is the basic through line of the human experience I can pull out of here? And that to me was part of the compelling aspect of researching Gnosticism, that even 2,000 years ago, people were like, this can't be all there is.
Mm-hmm.
There is something more. There is obviously an aspect of me. And it's not necessarily a complaint about the material world, but it is one of those moments where people go, no, there is something greater than this.
Mm-hmm.
And what ways do we have of accessing that? And in what ways are samsara, nirvana, Gnostic release, all kind of pointing at the same tradition that says humanity is great and wonderful. How do we access that? And that to me was the compelling part of these traditions.
Totally. I like, so when I participate in like online discussions about Gnosticism, especially like with somebody will post on Reddit and say like, well, if this text says this, then how does this spirit get to this level of this whatever? And I usually push against a kind of, I push against a kind of spiritual literalism in any form, but especially in Gnosticism, mainly because the texts are incomplete and not all together. But also to say that like any of this stuff, just what you said about many things pointing to one thing, is that thing that might be being pointed at is something that might be like that there is no single way to talk about it, and so everybody is going to talk about it in the way that suits the moment and the person in time, and so that becomes the handle by which you can approach it, or the scaffold by which you can kind of approach the thing, but the scaffold is not the thing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And you have this weird phenomenon where like so many different faith traditions have all come across services or manners of worship that are remarkably identical, where it's like, okay, we're going to do something that brings everyone into the room. We're going to remind everyone of why we're here. We're going to slowly build this ladder to say that we are looking at something that is other or greater or infinite or beyond us. Like the whole reason if you were in first century Rome and you attended a Jewish service, why there would be smoke and why there would be incense is you make the invocation of Shema Elohim, God is other, God is other, God is other. And that is so hard to get across to a modern listener or a modern reader. The idea that even thousands of years ago, humanity had the notion that there is this other thing and that anything that we do to describe it is going to fall short.
Yeah.
I'd also suggest, we were talking about this before recording, so unfortunately it only exists in our memory, but talking about Homer and sort of poetry as this like powerful thing. I think when you look at the history of writing in particular, when people saw writing as magic, there are two different ways in which that happened. There's the magic of being able to communicate across time, because you write something down, send it 1,000 miles away, and then someone reads it, and it's like you've spoken to a person across a distance. But it can also create that feeling that you were talking about, Terry, of like everyone doing the same thing at the same time. Poetry and language can put you into that same state. So when you think of the Gnostic texts as being incomplete and fragmentary, they're still beautiful and like they just awaken something as you read them. So the fact that that power was being explored and developed in parallel with these other traditions that were more focused on putting down laws and putting down histories and putting down, the Acts of the Apostles and all of that, it speaks to some kind of need in the people that were exploring this. In my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, no, I like that leads to so many, and I mean, maybe we might have to spin this off into another show, because I don't want to lose too much of the thread of the stuff you guys covered in that other episode. But like, just to say, Puka, I agree completely. Like, I think looking at how, like, I look at how like Christianity became like the Roman Catholic Church and became this like and then like also Orthodox Christianity and like all the various elements, is that like a lot of that has so much to do with that problem of instantiation, and like as things kind of continue to progress, like oh, okay, well, if this was inspiring, then this is the only thing that's true, and then therefore I need to make a rule about how I talk about this,
So this was my inroads into Gnosticism from an academic point of view, because I first read like the Nag Hammadi texts and everything. I had a seminar in college that was the first 7 councils, and it was just going through the first, like the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, all of those. You had violence, you had brawls over these things like, was Jesus human or human and divine or just divine? And those branches got pruned away in the development of Catholicism, but they didn't disappear. They just became other sorts of beliefs that people held, whether in secret, whether in small groups. We read, so like the core texts for me were Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels and The Origin of Satan, which I think are still like go-to texts for me. Also Jacques Le Carrier's The Gnostics, which I guess was originally Les Gnostiques because he was French. Beautiful, beautiful. introduction. But that poetry is also, I've come to appreciate the Gnosticism, the sacred texts, I guess you would call them. I've come to appreciate them a lot more through the art that has reflected them. So I had the background in poetry as well. So like reading Milton and reading Blake, those kinds of things.
I think that's so fascinating. There's the whole thing of like, for somebody that's ostensibly hating Satan, Milton sure makes him awesome, right? And like, I've often, like, one thing I've been saying in some of my local community groups and stuff is that I think I'd be interested, like, imagine if we talked about theology the way literary academics discuss literary texts, which is to say, rather than demanding a certain kind of mutual exclusivity, like, I need you to be wrong for me to be right. If instead of, if it operated more from the sense of like, I'm going to try to explain to you why I'm right by proving it, but neither of us are wrong, if that makes sense. Like, because the book still exists. No one is going to argue that the book doesn't exist. And so, it just, if what it would look like if nobody had to be, if there was no universalist, mutually exclusive attempt in religion, if that makes sense.
I think we started to get that in Christianity with the 19th century German critical tradition, where we started looking at the Bible qua it being a text. But that's generally not the conversation we're having. One of the things, I can't remember who originally introduced me to the idea, is there are faith traditions where the laity tends to be more dogmatic than the priestly group, and different faith traditions where the priestly group tends to be more dogmatic than the laity. I think you had mentioned that you were a half-hearted Lutheran. I can't remember the exact phrase you used. But as a questionable Catholic who spends a fair amount of time with half-hearted Methodists, it is interesting to me to see the amount of times in which the laity is more dogmatic than the priestly group, where you're like, we're not entirely sure how all of this came out. It's awfully weird that Matthew and Luke are so on the same page, but they seem to refer to this other text, and people are like, what you gonna do? And it is actually the laity that gets into that fight. And I think that relationship between the academic version and the received version, as it were, it is something that seemingly shifts over time.
Well, and this is kind of an interesting element in, I think, modern Gnosticism, is that on one hand, I think a lot of people come to modern Gnosticism because it's an alternative to a lot of other traditions. It's also an alternative that tends to focus on questioning. But one of the criticisms I've had of a lot of modern Gnosticism,
favorite piece of punctuation is the question mark, and I appreciate that.
Is that in some cases there's some modern Gnostic approaches, I think, are dogmatic in another direction, where they're so focused on being heretical and being like rebelling against a faith tradition that they're not, like, they're more focused on the demiurge than they are on Gnosis, if that makes sense. It's like, let's write up all of the lore of all of the archons that are trapping us, but nobody's actually talking about, like, how do we get together? How do we share some light? So that's just my own, like, annoyance. Something I try to push back against in this show.
Yeah. Do you find that Gnostic groups historically, and maybe even now, that, like, there's that initial sort of thing that draws people towards them, in that it offers an alternative to orthodoxy that feels confining or doesn't fulfill something towards them? They get into these groups, and then as those groups grow and expand over time and develop their own traditions, they become just as dogmatic as the thing that everybody left behind.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think there's also, like, particularly within that sort of Christian Gnostic strain, the answer to the problem of evil, like, the reason, exactly. Like, the reason the world sucks is because someone made it suck, and that wasn't God. God actually, like, tried to make it not suck, and then someone else made a mistake. Like, and that is, I think that's comforting. It can be comforting, but to me, it's also, again, it's focusing on the demiurge. It's not focusing on, and I think it is also isn't borne out by the by the texts. Like a lot of even the more hardcore texts are still generally talking about the world as a thing that's distracting you spiritually, not like literally physically trapping you in a thing. Like, so yeah, like I think that dogmatism can kind of come in because of the comfort of that easy answer. But the thing I often say is that to be a Gnostic to me would be to be always being critical, even being critical of the things that are comforting you about Gnosticism.
That's a real hard place to live in, though.
Yeah,
that is something that requires that becomes a practice unto itself, because
100%.
it's too easy to fall into the radical skepticism of being like, Hume was just the start. I can't even believe my own sense experience. I could be a brain in a jar. But at some point, like, you have to go to work. Like, at some point you have to pick up the newspaper and you have to make dinner, and like kind of that compromise between the essentials of everyday life and those philosophical necessities seems like a real hard circle to square. And I feel like Gnosticism, more than most traditions, kind of pushes that to the front.
It does. Yeah, I think it really does. Like it forces the conversation. Even if you're being dogmatic on the demiurge stuff, it still to me means that you're talking about it, and someone else is going to be like, and like this is often the thing I push back against is the like that sort of total nihilism, that some modern Gnostics can fall into, of like everything is terrible and the whole world is terrible. Is that like, well, yeah, but you're still gonna make dinner,
Yeah.
You're still gonna like go to the like you're still gonna keep breathing. Like those are things that are gonna keep happening. It's often actually I describe myself as a stoic Socratic Gnostic,
Ladies.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That brings all the girls to the yard for sure. No, in that sense of saying like, okay, I'm gonna ask myself, what can I affect about the things that are affecting me, and how and why do I believe whatever I'm believing? So it's always that process of questioning what's going on and what I can do about it, but from a perspective of continual moving forwardness. Sorry, that kind of got off into my own profile there. That's not
we're meeting you for the first time. This is a Wizard podcast first date. I get it.
Yeah, it's a podcast first date. Exactly. It's a crossover.
Swipe right.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Swipe right for Gnosticism.
This is a sort of pleroma experience we're having here on the digital world. So okay, we had some really great tangents there. I want to see if I can bring it back to a little bit more of the show that you guys did. So is there like when you're working on material, and we've already touched on even your own life experiences that you bring to this, but is there something that you're specifically when you're doing your show and you're like, okay, we've researched this thing, are you looking for like what are the kind of hooks that you find to make it worthy of being applied to a mage game or being part of the podcast?
So for me, when I want to discuss a real world tradition, the thing to me is within the world of Mage the Ascension, to do an effect, to cast fireball, to control someone's mind, to teleport, to turn a bunch of forks into a sentient army that will destroy your foe. The kind of three things you need is a paradigm, a practice, and an instrument. The paradigm is the way you believe the world works. Like, yes, the demiurge is getting in the way, but we have this fundamental divine essence. Cool, easy, great. How the dink do I use that to cast a spell? Because at the end of the day, this is a game of imagination where you're a wizard. And I had a very uncomfortable conversation with the group of attorneys within my own firm, because the podcast was sufficiently popular and the Patreon did sufficiently well that they're like, oh, you need to sign a conflict of interest form. And they're like, Mr. Robinson, are you indicating you do a podcast about how to be a wizard? And I'm like, no, it's even dorkier than that. We're talking about how to play a game where you are a wizard. I'm not claiming any wizardly powers. And they're like, I see. And I've never felt more judged by 2 words in my adult life than hearing a middle-aged attorney go, "I see," referring to a podcast I do about how to play a game where you're a wizard.
You realize there's a non-zero chance that they might hear you report that.
Yeah. And then the next question is like practice. What is the verb that goes with that real world belief? So for instance, I could do a podcast episode on deontology versus consequentialism. Again, another panty dropper of a topic that both of us could cover. But it's not it's important, but it doesn't let you do magic. It doesn't tell you the verb. And then finally you have the instrument, which is the noun. And to me, I want to see something that is a combination of all those, that has a world belief, that has a practice, a thing you do tied to it, that I can describe in the game to say that, okay, this character is a Dickean Gnostic. They believe the best way to deal with the demiurge is going to be technology, which lets us access a truer form of reality, which lets us ingest more data, that lets us get rid of outside experiences. Or I could go to like a Manichaean tradition where a character to do magic starts their day with 3 hours of purification rituals, where they say, we're going to focus on the Pauline epistles because we believe these to be truer, or something like that. The other thing that I want to see with a real world tradition is, like, I don't want it to be demeaning a priori. Like, I could probably do, if I had no moral scruples whatsoever, a banging episode on Jewish blood libel. I don't want to do that episode. Like,
don't want you to do that episode either. It's insane.
I mean, that's just of what is the belief, what is the verb, and what is the noun. And that's a common thing with a lot of conspiracy theories. We're like, oh, okay, we could talk about the reptoids or something like that. I'm like, I don't want to do that. The other thing to me is, does the practice group want to share this knowledge? And the best example of that is there are a lot of Aboriginal groups in Australia that consider their practices sacred. They don't want their beliefs represented in an RPG. So I'm not going to do an episode on that. Like, that is just kind of the basic respect. Do I feel I can inform? Do I feel I can give a basic understanding that someone can add this to their game and respectfully integrate a real world faith tradition or real world belief system into their game? And that's kind of what I want to say. I have a friend of mine that was an author. A game that Puka and I are tangentially related is called Scion. And basically the contrivance of the game is, you are the child of one of the gods in some way. Literally, it could be Leda and the Swan, and you are the result of Zeus banging someone. It could be the case that you are a divine vessel, that Hephaestus forged something that you have inherited, which connects you to a divine heritage. In another case, it could be the Pajit, the Egyptian pantheon, and you are actually the inheritor of the sacred beliefs of Anubis or something like that. And in all of those cases, those real world beliefs are comfortable kind of sharing what they know. So I want to see that is there. And those are kind of my general rules on it. And sometimes that goes into weird places, like chaos magic is a intensely modern practice in certain critical ways. Esoteric Christianity is millennia old at this point. Like, how can I present those reasonably? And that's what I'm going for as a podcast host.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, and that's, I really like how you're it's not specifically like game first in that sense of like, can I use this for the game in some like awesome way? It's like, it sounds like there's a sense of care and concern that's part of the whole thing, which I think is the ethics of that are phenomenal.
The key thing that I've learned over doing this for so many years is I failed to consider how nuanced real world beliefs are. So for instance, I was talking with someone who was talking about heathen beliefs, and they said, do I believe in Odin? And in a real way, they said no, but in a real way, they said yes. They said, do I think these stories are a way to convey the infinite complexity of the cosmos in a way that science has yet to capture? Yes. And this person and I had a debate over whether or not, I can't remember the specific term they used, but basically there is a term in certain heathen beliefs that says, does this express belief in kind of a divine way, in kind of this inspired way? And their question was, does Chat GPT possess that? And I'm like, this is not a question that I would have even asked. Like to translate into Gnostic beliefs, it would be something like, does Chat GPT have pneuma? And that's not a question most people will ever ask of themselves, but holy dink, did me asking that question change and give me another lens through which I could view the goings on of the world. And I think that is invaluable. I'm not going to change anyone's belief, but the best I can do is say, hey, there's another way of looking at the world that is kind of important. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm a soft-hearted liberal. And I think the best thing we can do is realize that we're all kind of doing the same thing in certain basic ways. And by spreading knowledge of what everyone else is doing, do we create a more unified humanity? Yes. Does that allow us to ultimately tackle the demiurge and free ourselves from the prison of separation? Maybe. Not entirely sure.
I think at this point, this is when I need to reference the Humanitron that you guys mentioned in your episode, where all of humanity comes together and defeats the demiurge.
Yeah.
There was something I was going to ask about there. Just what you're saying there about the notion of like, do I believe in Odin? Like, no, but yes, kind of thing. That actually reminds me of, are you familiar with the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast?
Terry is.
Yes. I got drunk sick 5 years ago and emailed the podcast host and said, hey, I do a podcast about an RPG. You want to come on, Ernie? And he's like, that sounds fascinating. And I have not worked up the cojones to reply to that email. It is dated July 11th, 2020. And one day I will get back to it. This is a person who has put more thought into what they see at a local diner menu than I think I've put into all of the considerations I've made about what I am as a moral human being combined. And frankly, that is terrifying, but that's just me.
Well, so we've had him on the show. He was great. And I'm sure he'd be happy to hear back from you. It also took us forever to put the episode up because we had a technical snafu that like turned it into an editing nightmare. But all of that aside, there was an episode that he did ages ago where he mentioned that when Christianity was really kicking off, the Romans would have found it weird to have some of these guys saying that their God was more real than anyone else's God. But they were like, it was like, what? Why would you even say that? That's so weird. Like, and that has always stuck with me as a question of like the notion of the reality of anyone else's gods. To me, seems like it's nowhere near the right question. It's nowhere near the right conversation. Yet it's the one that we keep getting drawn into. So I think that just that notion of like what you said there about do I believe in Odin? Yes and no. I think that just reminded me of that.
Yeah, I think we are very comfortable with the idea that there are different levels of abstraction, and to treat anyone as more real than the others is difficult. I can say they are more immediate or more intimate, but again, the process of talking about people's faith traditions has made me fully respect that there are people out there that have mystical beliefs in physics and finance that are just as esoteric seemingly as someone who is a member of the Ordo Templi Orialis. And that is just wild to me.
But it is also one of the core conflicts in Mage. Like that idea that I'm right and you're wrong is like, essential to the setting.
Well, and actually from a gameplay perspective, this might be an interesting thing to bring up, is that if anyone listening doesn't already kind of know, part of the thing I would say defines most of the World of Darkness games is that it's never just like, you're never just playing a mage. It's like, it's clubs within clubs, if that makes sense. Like in groups within in groups of, and that then have mutual exclusivity with each other, and they're fighting each other. And, like there's like 5 or 6 different vampire groups and
13.
Holy crap. Okay. So yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, like I think there's it's interesting how even I guess that issue of mutual exclusivity is represented in the game. That it's not like maybe like in D&D you might imagine that most characters are being generally heroic, if that makes sense. They're kind of moving in the overall similar direction, whereas like in a mage game or a changeling game, maybe not. Like,
and as Puka says, that's one of the fundamental conflicts. What is the degree to which we can all kind of live with one another? So you have the group within the game, the technocracy, who believe in a very materialistic worldview and believe that safety can only be achieved by everyone agreeing in this thing that is this kind of materialist science. And then in contrast to that, you have the traditions that say, no, we can have both safety and wonder. We can recognize what we do as being true without excluding others. And I don't know about you, that's a really hard line to ride just as a human being. Because there's this critical level where if I do believe that Jesus is our Lord and Savior and is the only avenue to salvation, I want everyone else to believe that. Like, so it is this weird soft-heartedness that says, I am right, but you get to be right too. And that exercise, if I were to belong to an established faith tradition, I have a fondness for the Batian Islamic sect, which essentially says God is infinite and ineffable, and any claims we make about God of necessity have to be false because all claims are fundamentally an act of limitation. When we say God is wise, we are saying that God is not wise.
Yeah.
Like we are saying that God is ignorant. And just the amount of work that I had to do as an asshole white male teenager to recognize that there are other ways to approach the world, and I cannot say that I have a monopoly on truth. That to me is the existential exercise that I enjoy so much about the game. That I have to be willing to put on different existential clothes and step into a different room within my mind to say, if I were someone who believed in charismatic fake healing, how would I think the world works? If I were someone to believe that phlogiston still existed, what would that require of me? If I were someone who believed in these highly hermetic theories of the way reality worked, how would I think? And that to me is the magic of role-playing games, the ability to put on those different clothing.
But possibly quite literally the magic of role-playing games.
Yep. That to me is also the benefit of those episodes, like to do an episode on Mage the podcast about Gnosticism, because you can interpret it through the lens of mechanically, how is this going to get me to cast a fireball or whatever in the game? But the World of Darkness has always also sold itself on being very, it's the storyteller system. They want you to get involved in your character's story more than just rolling dice and doing damage and whatever. So if you're going to accept that, you have to think about not just how does my worldview shape my magic, but how does it inform the choices I make as an individual? And that, I think, requires a lot deeper knowledge than you'll get from just the books. In most cases, some of them are pretty thorough.
Yeah. Oh no, well, and that's actually kind of a thing about like just the books as a thing that often have bibliographies and then inspire more reading and inspire to creating episodes about these further things. This actually makes me think of like, and I just mentioned earlier my own experience of playing D&D, getting references to the Nag Hammadi, and then getting interested in Gnosticism. Maybe as a slight coda to that, I'll say that what interested me in Gnosticism was never the notion of we live in an illusory world or a prison world, and we're trying to get out. It was the idea of the divine spark, that everyone has a little bit of illumination and that we're all trying to connect that illumination with each other. I'm like that. So in my day job is I run a theater company. That sounds a heck of a lot of like what it feels like when I'm in a room and a show that I'm directing is connecting with an audience. That feels like we're kind of fanning the flames together, So I was like that, okay, this is what I'm a Gnostic now,
Do you ever find it wild to find these texts that are literally thousands of years old that seem to all be pointing at the same thing? Like my favorite is in the archives of Limerick Zim, we have a letter from Ashurbanipal's wife that says, "I hear the lands you are conquering are cold. Please wear the scarf I've made for you." And you're like, this is 3,000 years old. And this is a message from a wife to a husband saying, please stay warm. Like when you look at the Thunder Perfect Mind, or you look at the Gospel of Judas, or you look at the Gospel of Thomas, and you're like, oh man, these are the same problems I deal with on a day-to-day basis, but somehow they cut to the core of it. That is just wild to me as a person.
My favorite is Cicero complaining about how these days nobody respects their elders and everybody's working on a novel.
Which pulls back to an earlier Babylonian, or technically Neo-Assyrian text that says that kids these days don't know how to behave. And you're like, this is 6,000 years old.
Human's gonna human.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's I think Mike Duncan had the History of Rome podcast, or no, it was the guy before him, Lars Bronworth. I think this is podcast archaeology that everyone's hearing right now is but anyway, he had this amazing podcast, 12 Byzantine Emperors, and what he kind of said is that he was trying to push back against a notion that we are always at that the modern day is at some sort of pinnacle of history, and that and that we are somehow different or special or more developed because of where we are, versus thinking that, as you say, humans are going to human. It's like the wiring is the same. It's just the setting is different. And so that wiring is going to respond in similar ways. But yeah, so to kind of go back to that notion of being inspired by games that then inspire you to go and do more research. Like, I know I'm not alone. There are a lot of esotericists who can point to D&D, point to Mage. Cult is another game that's in that world as well, that either kicked off a lifelong fascination or reinvigorated a fascination and a practice of esotericism. Is there something that you guys would say might be specifically unique to role-playing games that inspires that shift or that engagement?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. When you play a spellcaster, well, okay, so if you're playing like a fighter or a rogue or any of these D&D classes, you can relate that very tangibly to your own experience. Maybe, hopefully not getting into fights all the time or anything, but there's a physicality to it. You compare that with playing a spellcaster, and I think role-playing inspires you to get into the head of the character. And when you have, as they call it, bleed between the character and the player, where you kind of have this emotional connection with the character that you play, and maybe the decisions you make in your game kind of bleed back into your own life. So if you're slinging spells around in this D&D session, you're going to think, why can't I do this in my own life? And maybe conversely, you're considering why your character has that ability, what they're thinking as a person as they're doing it, all of that. So if you have that kind of, I don't want to go so far as to call it two-way communication between you and your character. I think that does lead to deeper consideration and exploration in your own life. It's important to remember that games are games, and any kind of practice you move towards is not going to look like the spell slots on the sheet and everything, but just that basic concept of, I'm trying to get into the psychology of someone who's able to do things that there's no way for me to do in my own life, but what can I do in my own life to give me that same feeling of, I mean, for a lot of people, I think it is control over their own life, but maybe just connecting with something divine, or having some kind of sensation, putting on the sensors, as Terry said earlier, for other aspects of the world that are not so mundane or physical.
Yeah, like learning a different kind of engagement or interrelationship.
Exactly.
Yeah. Terry, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's something that I've certainly wrestled with. I think we all heard the phrase knowledge is power, and I think we wanted it all to be more literal than it actually was. So to me, one of the things that an RPG forces you to do is say there is a system of the world, and you have access to it. And I think that poses the pretty potent what if there is a system of the world? And within an RPG, your characters are generally not familiar with the rules. There's a level of abstraction there. The rules are not diegetic in the sense that they do not exist in the world. And to me, the idea that there is a way in which the world operates that is not accessible to me is the first step of esotericism, to say, what if I did know what they are? And I think the process of forcing you to abstract an entire cosmos makes you go, what if this is actually how things work? How would I get access to that instruction manual? And in some cases, that leads people to try to accrue power. In other cases, it leads people to say, no, there is in fact a set of operations I can do to gain temporal power in the world. I can go into finance, I can go into politics, but also at the same time to say, that's not the path to quote unquote power that I want. I think a lot of people who've played RPGs have played the power fantasy game where they're a level 20 fighter and a level 21 cleric or something like that. Or to put it in mage terms, have 5 dots in all the spheres. And they quickly see how unsatisfying that is. And to me, and to me, the path to esotericism or to other belief is to say, no, there are other criteria along which we can evaluate success and progress. What could they be in your world? And I think that necessarily causes a certain kind of moral growth. I'm not going to say it's necessarily better than what anyone else is doing, but as you said, the key to Gnosticism or being a Gnostic is that process of questioning. And I think RPGs very much encourage that in a way that I think is fruitful and useful, but if not combined with a grounding and a community, can be slightly delusional. Now, in media, those are wildly overstated, but heck, is that a good start? You're combining to say, there is a way the world works, and I'm going to demand of myself the ability to put myself in someone else's shoes. And I think that just opens you up to the manifold types of human experience and makes you go, what's really going on here? Or what other ways do I have a view of this in a way that I can only view as healthy and fruitful?
I think like that's such a great way of putting it. I think that it's quite literally the search for it also increases the value of the thing found. That like by spending all of that time and energy to ask those questions, you get really invested in the answer. It makes me think of like Dark Souls and Elden Ring are famous for having little tidbits of lore that they barely tell you, that we devour hungrily because of the difficulty of finding it, and we get very invested in that because of the work, and there's maybe something about that, about like the work of as a player being continually challenged, then creates like kind of like a sort of a pedagogical loop, that you're, but then as you kind of said there too, is that there's also that risk of being destabilized by it. Like you're getting so intoxicated with this wisdom and ideas that it starts to become your whole world. And then, and like
there's a very, there used to be, certainly in Mage, like in all the World of Darkness books to some extent, but especially in Mage, they used to have these disclaimers at the start of the book that was like, this is a game. This is a game. This is a game. You do not have magic powers. And I mean, part of that, it was the 90s. They had satanic panic and they needed to have liability stuff, I guess. But I almost wish that had been mitigated more and said, like, this is a game. However, it is inspired by this and this, and you should go look, etc. Terry has a phrase that he says on the podcast often, which is that RPGs are a technology. And I've sort of adopted that line of thinking as well. I think that they're a technology, but they're a technology for exploring these things in, if not a safe space, then potentially a safer space than your own life. I grew up in a household that I had a lot of Catholicism flying around and some Quakerism flying around. And there wasn't a lot of room to explore stuff that was like esoteric in the way that I needed. So those books really did like put me on a path towards something that was very fulfilling. If I hadn't had that, I've met people who have just like dived headlong into something that was self-destructive, or even worse, destructive towards others around them. So I think you do need some kind of I don't know, training wheels or whatever metaphor you want to kind of make that leap. In many cases, you need those.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. It also makes me wonder when you say like role-playing games as a technology, there's a sense of like, is there some kind of safe way to like more explicitly use role-playing games, not as a conversion tool, but more like a maybe like for an established group or something, to do like essentially the equivalent of like astral exploration, but doing it within a game structure, because the constraint of it might create an interesting flow. I don't know. Sorry, now I'm just freestyling here, guys.
And to me, one of the things that you bring up in that is a weird contrivance of RPGs is the character is never powerless because no one wants to play that game.
Mm-hmm.
Like the easiest way to destroy an RPG is like, you've been captured by the bad guys. Well, screw this. This isn't interesting. And I think we are so used to having a incredibly limited domain of action that seeming freedom of an RPG reminds us that there are 1,000 ways in which we can change the world around us. Not to be too germane, but in the United States, we're coming up on a political election, and all of my friends divide into two groups: the people that worry and the people who did something. So I have a lot of friends that are like, I knocked on doors, I wrote a check, I called all my friends. I'm not worried because I know I did what I could do. And that is just a very temporal, very human scale reminder, because in an RPG, we have a character sheet, and I can point to charisma or the spheres I have or this background or a gun. And I can say, this is the way in which I can change the world around me. And I think we as people in a lot of cases are kind of inured into a sense of there's nothing I can do. And to me, the glory of role-playing games is there is always something you can do, or it's a bad game. Reality is in no way bound by those things. But like, Jason, you've talked about the idea of like collecting light. A thing that frequently occurs in RPGs is saying, what is the minimum viable thing that keeps our group together? What keeps Puka's Chlorokin character and my practitioner of hermetic magic pursuing the same goal? And I think that experience of empathy and greatness is super powerful. And I think to me, that's kind of a theme of Gnosticism at its best. Like,
thank you.
One of the comics I very much enjoy is two people sitting, I can't remember what the context is, but they're like, what if we clean up the environment and global warming isn't in fact a thing? So it's one of those things. It's basically saying, like, even if the thing you're pursuing doesn't actually exist, the process of doing so is going to make everyone better in every conceivable way. So why not do it anyway? And that is something that is constantly demanded of an RPG group because everyone wants the contrivance of the game continuing. Have you done an episode on like finite and infinite games, the James Carr philosophical text?
No, but I'm fascinated.
Yeah. Basically, he says there are two types of games: finite games where you try and get a winner, and infinite games where your goal is to keep playing. And just the attitude of saying, this is fun, I want this to continue. How do I change my behavior to do that? I think is one of the things that RPGs teach that is productive just kind of for humanity. This thing is nice. How do we get civilization to continue? Now, one could argue fundamentally that is, to put it in terms of Buddhism, that is Maya, that is illusion. That is, that takes us away from here. But like, if we're going to be trapped in the prison, let's at least make it a nice prison.
Yeah, like worst case scenario, it's a nicer cell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what could be more Gnostic than that?
The real Gnosticism is the friends we made along the way. Yeah.
You know, you're not wrong.
Well, really, I think if you are that kind of person who's drawn to RPGs because you want to feel empowered in that way, I think it makes sense that you might also be the kind of person who isn't just in this system or tradition and going, well, and just sitting with it like, I guess this is what I'm stuck with. I think that's a type of person to be drawn towards aspiration.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And there was something I wanted to try to not forget there about the notion of empathy. I think there was something that you said there. Oh, yeah. that just going back to that notion of the collecting of the light and wanting the game to keep going, at least the game to keep going in the sense of being with each other. I think that's always been the frame around Gnosticism that I find that is at its best. You said something that like Gnosticism at its best. I said thank you, not because I think it was mine, that I said something that you quoted or anything like that. Just thank you for saying it, because I think I was so grateful to hear someone else express that about Gnosticism. I just want to make sure that it didn't. Anyone listening is like, why did he think? um, so this is a question I pre-asked you guys a little bit before, but I want to also dig into it here. Is that so? I like, why does Mage, why do all these games create esotericists? Do either of you define yourselves as esotericists in any way? And as much as you're willing to share on the show.
Yes.
Yes, question mark, the story.
I mean, I can say that for myself, my path through spiritual traditions has been a strange and winding one. At present, I suppose, say that I perform rituals that have a chaos vibe with groups of interdisciplinary pagans, all of whom have like interests in various esoteric things. But ultimately, yeah, there's a heavy dose of ecstatic practice in it as well. And we actually had a good conversation over the weekend at one group about unverified personal gnosis. So I was thinking about this episode, but that idea of, I think ultimately the people that I engage with and the strains of esotericism that I'm interested in are the ones that seek to not define that very personal experience of the metaphysical or the divine or whatever you want to call it, but just help you continue to build out that experience. So to make it familiar enough that it feels second nature to enter into that mindset or enter into those spaces and meet with other people who are coming from different places, but are there unified by that same purpose. To me, Gnosticism, one of the more interesting things about it is that it isn't an offshoot of just one religion. You have aspects of it that are drawn from, different groups that the orthodoxies of those groups might want nothing to do with each other, or say they have nothing to do with each other, even if they're not aware of it. So that communality is something that I find very, very nice in those spaces.
And to me, kind of the idea of having never been asked if I was an esotericist before, that was like
surprising considering you do a show about magicians.
I'm just the host. My goal is to get out of the way and let other people say the interesting thing. To me, there are a bunch of different definitions of esotericism. One is that there is a group that has secret knowledge. Do I believe in that? Yeah. Like, I do calculus in the workplace. Is calculus a secret knowledge? We're not trying to hide it or anything. But boy, howdy, is that limited to a certain group of people. Do I consider that esoteric? No. The other definition that just made my heart leap when I saw it was that in a world where things are becoming less magical, there is a group that says, no, there is magic here and we can enchant our day-to-day living. Do I recognize with that? Oh, yes. We are hydrogen that gets to experience the world. Every element in our body beyond iron was created by an exploding star. My wedding ring was forged in the collapsing heart of a second generation stellar object. There is neon rain on Jupiter. Do I think that the amount of wonder in the world needs to explode? Yes. Do I think that all of this is beautiful and gorgeous? And does it make me almost cry sometimes? Yes. So in that key way, as people try and, in that key way in which people try and say, no, this is banal and stupid, do I kick back on that at every opportunity I can? Yes. So in that way, I think the world is magical and wonderful. And as I've gotten older, I have worked very hard to maintain that. I've worked very hard to not give into that. And the two ways of doing that are, one, keep learning. Two, spend time with kids. And anyone who doesn't regularly engage with youth, I think, is doing themselves a disservice. The ability to step back into a world where you do not understand, you do not purport to understand necessarily how things work, and the world is strange and dangerous and wonderful and beautiful, is something that we as humans should do regularly. And I think in a lot of cases, the esoteric does that, where we have rituals and signs and symbols to say, there is something beyond what we experience. We do not have access to it. And maybe if we're lucky, we will get hints and glimpses of that over the course of our life to it. And in that way, I hope we all become esotericists.
Oh, you're warming my changeling heart, Terry. Just briefly, like what you just said about secret knowledge, the knowledge isn't secret, but people think it is because it's presented that way because it's a threat often to other systems of knowledge that want to maintain, these hard boundaries and this isolation. And I think it is incumbent upon esotericists who have that kind of that desire to spread wonder in the world, that you need to be prepared to help other people attain that knowledge. You have to be ready to teach them calculus if they ask, and that's important.
There's actually something that one of my co-hosts has said, Jonathan, that and it comes up in a lot of the other and Jonathan is a deacon, I think, in the am I getting that right? I'm the least churchy among these folks, but he's a deacon in the Apostolic Johannite Church, so he's part of a modern Gnostic church, and he and others in that group have said that Gnosticism is an elite to which anyone can be a member. So because elitism was another attack on Gnosticism, but it is truly the sense of anybody who wants to, there's no locked door, there's no secret teaching that we only teach the people who are really loyal. It's just that it's a lot of hard work, kind of like calculus, it's going to be hard and difficult and confusing, and that's the thing that keeps people away, not hooded robes of people who wear calculator medallions.
Well, but we have to make a craft and mage for that test.
On it. Could be on the Storyteller Vault.
There's and there was something that you said to Terry. Sorry, this whole thing has been so inspiring. I'm trying to remember what it was, but there was that notion of that finding of the wonder. To me, that is, again, that going back to that's finding that spark in everything. Yeah.
And it's really stupid. Jason, as a Gnostic, do you ever have this moment where you're at a grocery store checkout or something like that, and suddenly you remember Valentinus, in this world you are light, but it is hidden, you are the darkness, the light that cannot be contained. Is that something that seeps into your daily world, to be no, we are all shards of the greatest creation of all time, and because of that, I'm not going to honk my horn?
Yes. We've talked about this in other episodes, that this is the big issue, is how do you, because the other issue about Gnosticism is it can be really philosophical and abstract and intellectual, but how does this affect me when I'm behind somebody in traffic, which is where a lot of the more orthodox traditions have a step up, is that there's oh yeah, here's all the rules. Here's here's a clear, flow chart about what you should do to make sure you go to heaven. Don't worry, here's everything's thought out for you. But yeah, it is hard, I think, as a Gnostic, to sit there and say how do you how do I recognize their divine light when they just cut me off? Yeah. Oh, and the other thing, I did remember, Puka, you mentioned earlier that so much of Gnosticism that we now have is not one tradition. It's borrowing from all of these other traditions, and that Houston Smith had a great lecture on Gnosticism that I think exists out on YouTube in sections now, but as an audio thing. But he said that there's big G Gnosticism, which is the stuff that we could say Valentinus and Cephian, and where there's, whether or not they called themselves Gnostic, it's probably clearly a good term for that group. but then there's big G Gnosticism, but then there's small G Gnosticism, which is to say the approach. And that's always been kind of my thing. Is like I'm a Gnostic, but I'm a small G Gnostic. Like I don't pray to like Sophia specifically, or anything. Like it's
She's great,
more
though.
fun of that. Yeah, nothing against her. Wonderful gal.
Yeah.
I'm more a fan of Promethea, but
well, if we're going to go into the comics discussion, I am ready.
Yeah, that I haven't done yet. But like the thing you mentioned reminds me of the quote from the Gospel of Philip: "Truth does not come into the world naked." There is a definition of esotericism, which is people who are willing to do work to do the hard thing that is valuable. And in almost any conceivable way, whether it be someone who is like weightlifting or someone who is trying to write a novel, like I do feel that modernity has done a poor job of saying hard things are worth doing. And I feel that Gnosticism kind of does a good job as a response to that and saying, no, we can ease the journey, but we cannot get there for you. The journey of the pilgrim cannot be done by someone else on your behalf. And I appreciate that. And the growth of Gnostic churches is something that I kind of find endlessly fascinating. So the fact that your co-host is a deacon, like 30 years ago, we couldn't have said that phrase.
Yeah.
In most parts of the world. So I'm really curious to see where it goes. Does the West finally have an answer to Buddhism? Does the West finally have an answer? And we did for a while, but we just kind of gave up on it. Like the idea of the importance of mystery.
I think Houston Smith's like subtitle for his lecture was like Gnosticism, a Western path towards Asia. So yeah, completely. So, okay. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Let's have more of these conversations because this has been great. Well, we do have good guests. But is there anything that's maybe like that you wanted to mention before we kind of wrap things up here? Any kind of last thoughts? Anything that's still on the floor?
I think one of the important things is I'm actually going to throw it over to Puka, who hasn't really had a chance to talk about the contrivance of Changeling, which is something I've had a lot of time with, because Changeling is so a couple of months ago I saw the movie, I saw the TV Glow, and everyone who saw it said clearly this is a gay allegory, and the next person said clearly this is a trans allegory, and then someone said clearly this is an allegory for people caught in dead-end jobs. And anything that has the ability to talk to so many people, to me, has something interesting in its core. And to me, my fascinating with the game Changeling is one of the central contrivances is there is kind of this war between wonder and banality, that we can create a bigger cosmos or we can deny who we are. And to quote yet another podcast, there will always be a market for people who are willing to suppress who they are to go along with things. And to me, the magic of Changeling, as someone who doesn't necessarily resonate with a lot of those cultural themes, is something to the tune of, I am here for a finite time. I will be gone one day. What is it I can do to incept light and wonder in a world such that it will live beyond me and it will not be destructive? So I would kind of like to hand the baton over to Pook to talk a little bit more about Changeling and why it is a wonderful game. Because it's real easy for me to sell, hey, play Mage. You have the ability to change reality and you get to fight with other wizards.
I would like to point out there's a listener for the Mage the podcast who turns up on the Discord and has showed up on the show a couple of times, TL Webb, who is a machine when it comes to churning out memes that have to do with these games. And my favorite of his, he has one that's synergy between World of Darkness games. There's a vampire and werewolf, and the image he chose for that is like a vampire and werewolf having this torrid embrace under the moonlight, and it's this very like gothic romance novel scene. And then Mage and Changeling synergy is a unicorn driving like a van with a cloud of pot smoke coming in. So I think like we can get together on that kind of thing. In particular, Terry, when you said whatever it was, society makes hard things not worth it or whatever, I think in particular it makes hard things that aren't purely selfish not worth it. And Changeling Changeling is about that. You have, I mean, mechanically, you have these statistics that are glamour and banality. Those are the twin forces that you're caught between that drive to inspire artists and create beauty and create chaos, but hopefully a happy chaos, but not always, versus just weaponized apathy and this blithe acceptance of the things that are going to gradually grind you down into nothing. So it is in part self-serving, because in the game, your character thrives on that energy, like literally needs it in order to keep them aware of their own self beyond their humanity. But in another way, it's just they want to make the world a brighter place, or at least a more interesting place for everyone involved. So that's the kinds of stories that you tell in that game. I think that there are mage stories that go in that direction as well. So
making things brighter for everyone. I love that. Yeah.
If you would like to hear Continue to Go, please.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good segue.
If you'd like to hear more from me, go to magethepodcast.com.
Well, maybe actually just because I think we touched on it way at the beginning, but then more focused on Mage, is that because I'm not actually very familiar with Changeling as the core concept of it. Is it that the Fae, like literally, like the fairy court, that kind of thing, has been divorced from its realm, that kind of thing? Like, yeah, give me the same early pitch.
All right, the elevator pitch.
Yeah.
So in the long ago before times, the Fae moved freely among humans on Earth, or the Autumn World, as they call it. There was no separation between the Earth realm and what's called the Dreaming, which is the semi-sentient sum total of all human imagination through all time. Any dream, any nightmare that's ever existed exists in the Dreaming somewhere. It is infinite, it contains multitudes. As humans started to make their world more rigid, categorize things, depending on what interpretation you want to use, it could be the invention of science, it could be the forging of iron, various sort of folklore things. The worlds began to kind of peel away from each other. It was called the sundering in the game lore. And that accelerated faster and faster. It became harder and harder for the Fae to remain in the world, because just that force of banality was so toxic to them. The sort of critical point was called the shattering. It's in that 14th century. Usually in the game, it's associated with the Black Death, that it was just such a collective trauma for humanity that they completely lost all hope and wonder dissipated from the world. And the Fae were left with the choice of either abandoning the world and retreating into the Dreaming, or taking on human form and entering this cycle of reincarnation, which the sort of uptight nobles, the Shi, decided to mostly abandon Earth, and then the commoners, like your satyrs and your brownies and your house spirits, all these other sort of folkloric creatures, remained and hid within human form for the next several centuries. The modern conceit in the game is that what reopened the doors to the Dreaming was the moon landing in 1969, because the idea was the entire world was kind of unified in wonder to see man walking on the moon. Like, it just unleashed this surge of glamour that had never been seen before or since. And then the doors to the Dreaming opened, the Shi came back, and it reawakened all of this wonder in the world, but with a lot of consequences. So that's like the historical background of the setting, and they've updated it a few times, retconned it a few times, but the central conceit is still that you have this eternal, immortal, dream-soaked, story-laden heritage, but also, like, you might work at a fast food joint. So balancing those two extremes is I think, key theme of the game.
And I mean, this also reminds me of the sort of again, that central conceit of the whole world of darkness thing, is that it's underneath the normal world. It's like it feels like that was I don't know if it's as popular now, but that was a real like 90s trope of like, a world underneath what you currently see, urban fantasy, that whole thing. Highlander was like another example of that in a way.
Yeah. And as a metaphor, it was really important to me as a closeted goth teenager to have this game that was written by recently uncloseted goth 20-somethings. So
yeah.
One of the things that's kind of changed over time is, in the initial versions of it, it said the world is controlled by this conspiracy of vampires, wizards, werewolves, and weird fey creatures. Oh, and ghosts. And if you really want to change the world, you need to be in on that. And as time has gone on, it's been much more, no, this conspiracy rides the coattails of the mortal world. In Mage the Ascension, in first edition, the technocracy basically controlled the world, where in the most recent edition, it's basically been like the technocracy going, we can barely keep up with what these people are doing. How do we cut out the extremes, and how do we deal with the excesses? And that to me has been an interesting response to things. And to changelings, as someone who was never a goth, was never closeted, to me, the power of changeling is to say stories are real and important to who we are. Where we come from is important and fascinating. To what degree do we rebel against that? To what degree do we draw power from those stories? And how do we balance those with the necessities of the daily? And I think of any number of times where we have come up with a modern interpretation, whether it be Albert Camus' consideration of Sisyphus, to say, to keep rolling the boulder up the hill, he must be happy.
Yeah, we must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Yeah.
Or with a boulder rolling fetish.
Hot boulder action, women in your area.
We must imagine Sisyphus very happy.
Yeah, exceptionally happy, turgidly happy.
This boulder's all moist. I will say I was being a little bit glib when I'm putting it in my own experience when I say as a closeted goth teenager. I think the abstracting away from that is what the game is telling you, is that there is something rare and precious and special inside you, and you do have to take care of it. And the best way of taking care of it is by helping other people bring that out in themselves against what can be a cold and or cruel world.
And I think in the same way that some people like astrology and some people like Myers-Briggs, Changeling brings to the party the question of, so what do you feel your story is? And I think as a tool for reflection there, it is powerful. In the same way in Mage, it says, magic is the act of giving a damn and changing the world around you. What are your rituals? What are the spells you cast that you don't even know that you do? And I think in that regard, both of those are useful tools in what appears to be a cynical, nihilistic modernity. And if nothing else, play games. It is important to put on other people's existential clothing, to step into the role of the other for a brief period of time. And as I like to put it, tell stories that matter with people you care about. So if you're a person that maybe played D&D in high school, pick up Fiasco, pick up Raccoon Sky Pirates. There's any number of games that you can figure out in under 30 minutes that you can have an uproariously good time that will stick with you for days, months, or years.
Completely. Yeah.
I'll say.
And maybe that'll spread a little bit of light rather. And maybe you'll get a little bit of that, the fanning the flame inside between all of us. Well, that might be a nice area to kind of close out in. Anybody listening, watching, please feel free to like comment, note anything maybe that you had a question about. I think this was such a fun episode. I definitely want to have you guys back again. Or maybe I'll come on your show or something. But yeah, this was absolutely fantastic. So I can't wait to do more. I can't wait to dig into more of this. We didn't even talk about the game that probably feels like it's like the not sequel. I don't know what, descendant of Mage, Nobilis.
Nobilis.
We have to talk to my co-host Josh, because that's like
somewhere a man's ears stood on edge. I was thrilled to pieces that you like looking over your episode archive. I'm like, we've done a surprising number of similar episodes where it's like, we've also done an episode on William Blake. So that pleased me to no end.
Oh, maybe this is a quick PS here. Actually, one other PS is that if you are enjoying this show, we do have a Patreon. Feel free to check it out. Patreon.com/Gnostic. I think all the rest of the details are on our website. But the other coda is that maybe Terry, when we first started the call, I said before we hit record, I said like, what was it like to get an email from somebody saying, "Hey, I'm a Gnostic. I want to have you on our show to talk about your episode on Gnosticism." You said it was thrilling. Can you maybe just express that a little more again, as a way to close us out here?
I mean, I don't know who thrilling and terrifying, I think, were the two terms I use. But we're talking about people's real world beliefs. This is what you think. This is how you go about your world, and the ability to go from abstract concept to I've played this character to I've met someone to I have been changed by this is this kind of very tiny hero's journey that I don't know how many adults get to do that. And the ability to do that at the age of 40, I can't view it as anything but a blessing. I can't view it as anything but a justification of the work that you and I have both done to say, this is who I am, this is who I'm going to be in the world. Let me share the stories of other people. And as both of our podcasts fundamentally center people who are not ourselves. Like Talk Gnostic is not about Jason. And Mage the Podcast is not about Terry. So the fact that we get to say, I find this interesting, let me share this with other people, and suddenly more people know about a thing is nothing but enhancing and brightening in my world.
That's wonderful. So we just about gave Terry the last word, but Puka, actually, I want to throw it to you. Is there anything that you want to say before we close it out?
I mean, I'll just echo. I didn't receive the email directly, but I will say it was equally really for me, especially because, I mean, when Terry asked if I wanted to come record that episode, I was like, God, what the hell am I going to talk about? But I think the act of sitting with the idea of being in this conversation just kind of caused all of these thoughts and ideas to precipitate from, I don't know, the hither part of my brain. And that to me is a thrilling experience as well, on top of everything else. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. And I should also say thank you. And to any of our listeners, the next thing you need to do is go listen to their episode, not only to cover some of the same territory we covered here in other ways, in more mage-focused ways, but also to hear Puka read Thunder Perfect Mind, which is icing on the cake. So thank you both so much. Again, we'll have you back. Audience, please let us know what you had, what you liked, what you had questions about, so that the next time for our next conversation, we can dig even deeper into that stuff. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you guys again soon. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Take care.